Welcome back. The mission of the Economic Club of Chicago is to foster meaningful connections among Chicago leaders, to encourage dialogue on important social and economic issues, and to cultivate the next generation of civic leadership. Founded in 1927, the club has consistently provided a platform for global thought leaders to discuss economic, business, and social issues. I would encourage our many guests here today to visit the club's website to view our extensive list of past speakers. In keeping with the tradition of the club, our Questions Committee has gathered suggestions from senior leaders of Chicago to compile a list of thoughtful questions for our invited speaker, which we've given to our moderator today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and guest speaker. Our moderator, Greg Brown, is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Motorola Solutions. He became CEO of Motorola in January 2008 and led the successful spin-off of the consumer-focused Motorola Mobility in 2011. That same year, he was appointed by President Obama to the President's Management Advisory Board, as well as to the Skills for America's Future Board. He's a member of the Business Council, the Business Roundtable, and the Technology CEO Council. Greg is a civic leader in Chicago and serves not only on the Board of Directors for the Economic Club of Chicago, but also on the boards of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the Big Shoulders Fund, the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago, and World Business Chicago. Oh, and did I mention that in his spare time he runs Motorola Solutions? Greg also maintains strong bonds to his home state of New Jersey and his alma mater, Rutgers University. In fact, Governor Christie appointed him to serve on the Rutgers Board of Governors. Greg is joined this afternoon by his wife, Anna. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Governor.
Christie was sworn in as Governor of New Jersey on January 19, 2010, and re-elected to a second term on November 5, 2013. Born and raised in New Jersey, he has always expressed a strong passion and commitment to the Garden State in which he resides with his family. We are honored to have the First Lady of the State of New Jersey, Mary Pat, with us here today. Governor Christie has certainly brought his own style to the role. His unique approach has made him much more accessible to the public and given him the reputation of a no-nonsense, get-to-the-point kind of guy. Under Governor Christie, New Jersey has taken on the biggest and toughest challenges with real solutions and bipartisan cooperation. He has implemented an aggressive reform agenda to restore fiscal integrity and accountability to state and local government, lowered New Jersey's property taxes, and reformed the state's pension and health benefits system. In addition, Governor Christie has made education reform a top priority of his administration. He has worked to turn around failing schools, improve accountability, create a fair and meaningful evaluation system for teachers and principals, and increase school choice in the state's worst-performing districts by providing billions of dollars in additional state aid for New Jersey schools. Since Superstorm Sandy struck in 2012, New Jersey has made substantial strides towards recovery and rebuilding. The Christie administration has launched dozens of programs and services aimed at an unprecedented pace to put New Jerseyans back in their homes, reopen businesses damaged or destroyed by Sandy, and repair and improve infrastructure to withstand future storms. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Governor Chris Christie and Greg Brown.
John, thank you. Governor, thank you. Mary Pat, thanks for coming to Chicago. We talked about doing this September, October, in the fall, and I appreciate that it came together, especially on such a balmy day here in Chicago. Thought you'd like that. The Economic Club has a rich tradition and history of thought leaders, domestically, internationally, over 85 years of tradition, so we appreciate you coming here and spending a few minutes. Lots to talk about, got a whole host of questions. Start, if you will, dimensionalizing New Jersey. For the folks here in Chicago, the cliff notes, the key characteristics, and then we'll take it from there.
All right, well, first, it's on my lapel, so that's the size of it. Mary Pat and I, about 2 years ago, made a trip to Israel. And in Israel, when everybody tries to describe to Americans how big Israel is, they say Israel is the same size as New Jersey. And I kept saying to them, I know. 8.9 million people, the most ethnically diverse state in America. a state that has an extraordinary historic tradition. The second oldest continuously operating state house in America is the state house that I go to work in every day. The crossroads of the American Revolution. And so there's a great sense of history in New Jersey at the very beginnings of our country. And now today, still a burgeoning pharmaceutical industry, great state university that you're well aware of, that now will be spending a lot of time in the Midwest as a member of the Big Ten, and a state that faces significant challenges on a day-to-day basis because we're also the most densely populated state in America, and all the problems that come along with that. In addition to a god-awful winter that I wish would end yesterday, because there's nothing worse. Yeah. Any chief executive of a government will tell you, whether it's a mayor or a governor, that there is nothing worse than weather, because you have no control over it and complete responsibility for it. So, I'd like the winter to be over.
So a few weeks ago in Trenton, you did your State of the State remarks. As you think back on your first term, milestones, achievements, what are the reforms you're most proud of, and kind of inventory the key things that you got done there?
Sure. Well, first it was changing an attitude in the state. There was an attitude about government when we took over that just couldn't get anything done, and that people would just bicker with each other all the time. Under my predecessor, they had a government shutdown, as we've seen in Washington of late, and that's when the Democrats controlled both the governorship and the legislature, so even they couldn't agree with each other. So first was to try to change the attitude of folks, to say, we are here to accomplish things. We're not here to be doctrinaire. We are not here to push a particular philosophical point of view. We have them. But ultimately, my main job is to get things done to advance the ball for the people of the state. Mm-hmm. So in that respect, we tried to say, also as a Republican elected in a state that hasn't elected a Republican United States Senator for 42 years, as a Republican elected statewide, you're playing with house money, everybody. You're not supposed to be there. And so you need to take that opportunity to try to take on really big things and not play small ball. So what we did in the beginning was to say we're going to take on property taxes, which is a huge problem in our state. We instituted a 2% property tax cap, and also a cap on interest arbitration awards to public sector employees, also at 2%. That made me enormously popular with public sector union employees. But it's working. New Jersey in the last 2 years has had the smallest increase in property taxes in over 25 years, less than 2%, so the cap is working. Next, we took on pension and health benefit issues that you're very familiar with here in Illinois. And we took on those issues by doing the 4 things that you really need to do. Increase retirement age, increase the penalties for early retirement, eliminate cost of living adjustments, and increasing employee contributions. This is not rocket science. Those are the elements of what you have to do. I didn't get everything that I wanted, but we got a significant amount of what we needed to do. We took on teacher tenure reform. For all of you who don't like teacher tenure, you have New Jersey to thank for it. We passed the first teacher tenure statute applying to K through 12 teachers 105 years ago, and the rest of the country then followed suit. That statute had not been amended for 105 years. Now, anybody who works with a state legislature or a Congress knows that if they haven't amended a statute, it isn't by accident. They were paid not to amend that statute over time. And it made it very challenging for administrators who wanted to have quality teachers in the classroom to be able to rid themselves of the teachers who were not making the grade. We now have teacher tenure reform in New Jersey for the first time in 105 years, where if a teacher gets 1 year of a failing evaluation or 2 consecutive years of a below average evaluation, their tenure can be taken from them. This is a sea change in New Jersey, and we're now in the midst of instituting it, which will also be a battle. But I would say if you look back at the first term, those are 3 big reform issues. And then lastly, remember that in New Jersey, when I took over, we had, in my first full fiscal year, an $11 billion deficit on a $29 billion budget. A 37% deficit, which by percentage was the largest percentage deficit of any state in the country. And we balanced that budget without raising income taxes, sales taxes, corporate business tax, or any other tax in New Jersey. And I'm proud to say that 4 years later, we still haven't raised taxes. So that would summarize the first term.
So the question is, though, with all of those things and in a historically blue state, how did you do that? How did you do that?
Prayer. But also waking up every morning, secure in the knowledge that in divided government, I'm not going to get everything I want. That as much as I believe that my ideas are the right ones and the best ones, exactly as I articulate them, that, the other side's not going to agree. Sometimes they're not going to agree because they really do philosophically disagree. Sometimes they're not going to agree because they just don't want to agree with me, because I'm in the other party. So what you need to do is to develop relationships. And I think that's what's so lacking in Washington, D.C. today, are relationships. Remember, in government, we don't produce anything. We don't make anything. What we do is try to create, through laws and policies, a civilized society. Well, I don't know what you think, but I'd use a lot of words for Washington, D.C. today. Civilized would not be one of them. And I think this is the fault of everybody in leadership down there. Because, for instance, when I first became governor-elect, I had a series of meetings with Governor Tom Kean, who's one of my predecessors, and somebody who I have a great deal of respect for. And at the first meeting, he said, this is why I'd like to do this. You sit down, you ask me some questions, I ask you some questions, and I teach you about the governorship. Well, that was great. So the first question he asked me in the first meeting we had was, who's your best friend? And I said, my wife. And he said, not anymore. And I said, okay, who's my best friend? And he said, the Senate president is going to be your best friend. Because if you don't make the Senate president your best friend, you have no chance of being a successful governor. And the Senate president is a wonderful guy who is a friend, named Steve Sweeney, who's a Democrat and who is president of the Iron Workers Local in New Jersey. So it's good, two shy retiring guys from different parties trying to make a beautiful story. But the point that Governor Kean was making to me was that in the end, philosophical differences can only be compromised between people who have a trusting relationship. That when I tell Steve Sweeney I will do X, that he can believe that I will do it, and when he tells me the same thing. And so the way it gets done is the building of relationships. It doesn't mean that we always agree. We don't. We argue in public viciously. He talks about this. There have been some things he's called me publicly that I won't repeat here, that have been in the newspapers in New Jersey. We fight hard, but then we also make a commitment to each other to get in a room and get around a table and make progress for the people of the state. And I think that's the way it's gotten done, is by zealous, articulate advocacy of our positions publicly, but then the willingness to sit in a room and make a deal. Mm-hmm. And that's what government is supposed to be about, I think.
So, Governor, as you think about your second term, what are the priorities for the state of New Jersey's agenda, your agenda?
Well, it's continued economic growth. We've seen 150,000 new private sector jobs in the first 4 years of the administration. Unemployment has gone from 10% to 7.3%, but it's still too high and there's still too many people unemployed. So we continue to try to attract new business to New Jersey and be able to put people back to work. Secondly, it's the effective implementation of teacher tenure reform. Tenure reform will only work if the regulations that we put in place have the faith and confidence of both the teachers and the administrators, and so we're in the midst of working on that. Third is to continue emphasis on changing our criminal justice system. The war on drugs in New Jersey, and I believe in this country, has been a failure. It's a failure because we believe that we can take drug-addicted people, nonviolent drug-addicted people, put them into prison where they get no treatment, then release them and expect that they're not going to still be drug addicted, and then lead to all of the societal and criminal justice problems that come from that addiction. So what we've done in New Jersey, and I think we're one of the first states, if not the first state in the country to do it, is to say that for first-time nonviolent drug offenders, no jail time, mandatory inpatient drug rehabilitation therapy. We see that it works. And already we're seeing recidivism start to decline in New Jersey with these nonviolent drug-related type of crimes. So making that fully implemented in the state so that every one of these first-time offenders we have to expand the capacity of drug treatment facilities and obviously the funding to do that. But we're in the process of doing that, and I'm hopeful that that'll be something by the end of the 4 years that every person, and these are nonviolent offenders, the violent offenders have to go to prison. But for nonviolent, small-time drug offenders, it is time for us to get real about dealing with addiction in this country. It's destroying large portions of our society, and we need to get these people treatment because what we know is that with many, many people, treatment works, and then they become productive tax-paying citizens, good fathers, good husbands, good wives, good mothers, and that's all good for our society.
And as you think about it going forward, does the GW Bridge situation impact your ability to execute on those priorities for the state?
I'm shocked you brought that up. Here's the thing about government or about Motorola solutions.
Stick to government. Stick to government. Stay on government, government.
Yeah. You opened the door, buddy. Large organizations are dynamic and incredibly creative because they're inhabited by human beings. They're also inherently flawed because they're inhabited by human beings. And some people who work for me made some significant mistakes in judgment. And when you're the leader of that organization and you're confronted with that, the first thing that happens to you, it happened to me, was extraordinary disappointment. Extraordinary disappointment that people that I had trusted had made such bad judgments that had not told the truth. But you only have a few minutes to wallow in that disappointment. And then if you're a leader, you have to try to get a handle on the story and then take decisive action, which we did by letting people go and talking to the public about it. We're in the midst of an internal review now, and whatever that internal review discloses, we're going to release to the public, and if there's more action that needs to be taken, I'll take it. But I don't think that it will curtail, for the long haul, a second-term agenda, because I think the public in New Jersey won't tolerate it. The fact is that they expect me and the legislature to continue to do what we did in the first 4 years, which is to find solutions to New Jersey's problems and to get things done. And so while the last 6 weeks haven't been the most enjoyable of my life, I can guarantee you, on the other hand, the fact is we need to do our work. And I believe I had a meeting a week ago today with the Senate President and the new Speaker of the lower house, and they assured me they're committed to moving forward and getting things done, and I believe them. And so the time will tell. But I believe that we're focused on the things we need to be focused on, both in terms of fixing past problems and in terms of moving ahead with a new agenda.
So before we go to the national level, Hurricane Sandy, about 16 months ago, can you just quickly describe the impact, your response, and then maybe where we are now on that? I know that's a whole topic.
It's hard to describe the impact. Just give you some quick statistics so you have a sense of the scope. 365,000 homes severely damaged or destroyed. 7 million people without power out of 8.9 million people on the morning after Sandy. Every major state highway closed. 51 gas stations in the entire state of New Jersey opened and operational. We're talking about the complete devastation of a state. If you went on Google Earth on October 30th, 2012, and you scanned up the globe and you got to New Jersey, it was dark. The entire state was turned off. When you're governor and you wake up the next morning to that, what you try to do is say, how do I get life back to normal as quickly as possible? And by the way, every school in the state closed as well. So we ticked forward with the indicia of normalcy. And every day tried to get closer and closer to it. 16 months later, there are still thousands of people in my state whose lives are not back to normal, whose homes are not rebuilt, whose lives are still turned upside down. I'm going to hold a town hall meeting later this week in Monmouth County in one of the most devastated counties in the state, and talk to those folks about how we're doing, what progress we're making. We've made extraordinary progress, and we've had great help from the federal government and worked very hard to use those finances as well as we could. But to give you some sense of scope, there were $37 billion in damage done to the state of New Jersey by Sandy. Federal aid that will come to us will probably amount to no more than 15 to 20 billion. So you're talking about, even with insurance, a few $1 billion, an enormous gap will exist, and some people will not be helped. And so when I was yelling and screaming about Sandy aid in January of 2013, both at the other party and at my own, it wasn't because, I needed a few extra bucks to balance the budget. It's because every dollar that we've been shorted will have an impact on the lives of the people of my state. And as governor, your job is to fight for those people as hard as you can. So we're still working very hard. We're coming out with our second action plan last week to spend more of the federal money on resiliency and on home rebuilding. But think about trying to rebuild or repair 365,000 homes. It's going to take a while. It'll be years before we're done.
Let's pivot back to the national level. You referred to Congress. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates actually was in Chicago just a few weeks ago. Came out with a book, was pretty interesting. He talked about Congress being uncivil, hypocritical, among other adjectives. What should be done to focus our political leaders on collaboration instead of gridlock? I know it's kind of a huge issue.
Yeah, but listen, it is and it's not. I mean, again, it comes back to the answer I gave you before. The personalities have to change, or the situation won't change. Now, that means they either have to change themselves or they have to be replaced, because ultimately, it's not working right now. And I start with the president because he's the president. And the fact is that in this form of government, the executive is the person who I believe has to take the bulk of the responsibility for bringing people together. And I think that the president, in the main, has been unsuccessful at that. Now, there'd be lots of people who would give you lots of different reasons for it. But the fact is that he has been unsuccessful at that. And I think part of it was the way he came in. I don't think he came in with a respect for the other party. And the fact is that they were in the minority. He had supermajorities then, and he ignored them. You never know when you're going to need them. And then all of a sudden, John Boehner becomes speaker and doesn't have a relationship. Well, whose fault is that? And I think the president has to take a good share of the responsibility for the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. Now, so do every one of the leaders of Congress, because they could decide to be statesmen and bridge the gap. Some would say they've tried, and I've heard that argument for both Republicans and Democrats. But in the end, what the American people see is a completely dysfunctional federal government that right now is operating only by executive fiat. That is not the way this system is supposed to work.
So you think it's a leadership issue as opposed to any structural changes, nonpartisan primaries, redistricting, any of that come into play?
Well, listen, the only thing I would say that you're not going to change but contributes to it is redistricting, because the gerrymandering of these districts all across the country makes people much more afraid of primaries than they are of general elections. So when they're afraid of primaries, they move further to their right on the Republican side and further to their left on the Democratic side, because they're not worried about losing a general election because the district's been gerrymandered for one party.
So does that effectively mean, when you describe that the middle is dead?
No, it means the middle is suffocating, but not dead. The middle winds up being the determining factor in national elections, not district by district. And so, but on the day-to-day running of government, the middle feels suffocated because their voices are much more difficult to be heard when you have gerrymandered districts. That's the only structural thing I think is the issue. The rest of it I do think is a leadership issue, because this government, I mean, let's face it, people say, oh geez, how nasty politics is now and all the rest, and I understand that and acknowledge that that's true to some extent. But you ever read about the presidential election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson? I have. These great founding fathers, these extraordinary statesmen, were hiring people to write slanderous stuff about the character of their opponents and publishing them as if they were independent works and saying the most awful things about each other. Read about the election between Jefferson and Adams sometime. It'll turn your stomach. So this country has always had political conflict, but once someone's elected, it stops at the water's edge, traditionally. Lately, it has not. It's been a perpetual campaign. And the perpetual campaign is a problem for governing.
Let's talk about your role as chairman of the RGA. What's the state of play in the gubernatorial races nationally? What do you see?
Well, it's an enormous year. 36 states have governor's races this year. From the RGA perspective, 22 Republican incumbents. 22 of our 29 Republican governors are up for re-election this year. So it's going to be an enormously challenging year and expensive year to run across the country. I think that if you look at some of the governors that we now have across the country who are going to be running for re-election, they have great stories to tell. You know, whether it's Scott Walker in Wisconsin, or John Kasich in Ohio, or Rick Snyder in Michigan, Tom Corbett in Pennsylvania, Rick Scott in Florida, Susana Martinez in New Mexico, Brian Sandoval in Nevada. These are all really accomplished chief executives who have a great record to run on. And so I feel really confident about our ability to defend those Republican governors. The second part of the job then, as RGA chairman, is to look at the states where you have a possibility to pick up seats that are either open seats or currently held by Democrats. And we have a number of targeted states that we think are in play. I'm sitting in one of them. And so I think...
So what advice would you give a Republican gubernatorial candidate trying to get elected in Illinois?
In Illinois? Well, listen, have faith, baby. I won twice in New Jersey. I mean, that's what I'd say to him. It can happen. It can happen. Listen, I think everybody talks about different things in politics. And there's this, because of the success of the president's re-election campaign, there's now this real focus on metadata and data mining. And let me just say this about that. That's useful technology. But if you have metadata that you have data mined for a lousy candidate, you'll have great data for a loser. Okay? Barack Obama was not reelected president of the United States because of that. He was reelected president of the United States because the American people decided he presented as the best candidate for them. What I'd say to any candidate for governor of Illinois on the Republican side is be yourself, be authentic, tell people the problems and their scope and the nature of the solutions you'd like to bring forward. And lastly, and most importantly, let them get to know you. I don't believe voting, Greg, is like a checkbox thing. I don't think people go, okay, here are the 10 most important issues. Here's where candidate X and candidate Y stand. I check where I agree with each one of them. Oop, who's got the most boxes? That's who I vote for. There might be a few people out here who might actually do that. Get help. Voting, especially for an executive, a governor, or a president, is a visceral action. People look at the person and say, do I like the person? Do I trust them? Do they care about me? Do they understand my problems? Do they understand what I want from government? Are they honest? Can I trust them? If you don't pass that test, they never get to the checkbox. If you pass that test, then they get to the checkbox and you have a chance to get their vote. So what I'd say to any candidate anywhere is be yourself and let the people get to know you. They don't have to agree with you on everything. I tell candidates all the time, if you're more worried about being loved than you're worried about being respected, you may win, you probably won't, but you may win, but you will be a lousy governor. What you got to care about is being respected. People don't expect to agree with you on every issue. I say to voters all the time, if you want to vote for the person who you agree with on every issue, go home and look in the mirror. You're it. You're the only person you agree with all the time. So that's the advice I'd give to whoever the Republican nominee is going to be for governor of Illinois or any other candidate for governor around the country.
So since we're at the Economic Club, observations or assessment of the business climate, the current business climate in the U.S. and the state of the nation in that regard. Thoughts?
Improving, but not great yet. I think that there's some things that we probably should be doing that we're not doing at the national level regarding tax policy and regulatory policy that could help.
Like what?
Well, I'm not going to get into laying out the whole thing here, Greg, but I mean, the fact is that the tax system, in my mind, is a defeatist tax system. It is a tax system that people are working every day to defeat. That shouldn't be what a tax system should be. There should be a sense among people that the tax system is simple and fair, and that while no one likes to pay taxes, that they're looking to comply because they think that there's a general fairness and logic to it. Right now, I think we have a system where business people and everyday individuals are looking to defeat the tax system. And then that creates an atmosphere in business and in people's personal lives that is not productive. And from a regulatory perspective, I mean, there's certain things to me that seem just to be commonsensical that aren't getting done. Like, I cannot understand why North America and Central America are not becoming the energy capital of the world. And, so why aren't we doing more with Mexico to exploit those assets? Why aren't we doing more in America to exploit the assets we have here? And why aren't we building the pipeline from Canada to be able to exploit those assets as well? That is wrong-headed regulatory policy that is putting a blanket on not only America's economic development, but on our geopolitical strength. Because if you don't believe that if Mexico, the United States, and Canada were to become, which they can be based upon our natural resources, the energy center of the world, that would not change and strengthen our geopolitical standing in the world, then you haven't been paying attention to the decisions that presidents have had to make over the last 4 decades because of that problem.
So, speaking more about foreign policy, some have criticized President Obama for stepping back from America's traditional leadership role in global affairs. What are your thoughts on America's role globally?
I don't think it's particularly useful for the governor of a state to be spending a lot of time criticizing American foreign policy. I don't nearly have, I have certain instinctual thoughts on that, but I'm willing to acknowledge to everybody that I don't have the briefings and the background to be able to say that I understand all the intricacies of it. And I think it's irresponsible for someone who doesn't have the confidence that they know everything they need to know to be out there, criticizing the President of the United States in terms of his conduct of foreign policy. What I would say is that I do detect some confusion in the world about who we are and what we stand for. That's never good, regardless of how you define who we are and what we stand for. And that's what I'm talking about, those integral differences. I do detect some concern among allies that they don't quite sure who we are, what we stand for anymore. That needs to be clear for there to be a strong America and for America to be a strong influence in the world for good. But I've always, Greg, hesitated in forums like this or others when people get into foreign policy. I know that the vogue thing to do is to throw out a whole bunch of platitudes and generalities that if you're in the Republican Party are generally critical of the president and then back out as quickly as possible because you fear that they might ask you a specific question that you wouldn't have a damn idea how to answer. I decided to take it from a much more frontal approach, to tell you in the beginning that I don't know enough as I sit here today to be able to make specific criticisms, and so I'm not going to do it. When I do, if I do, know enough to have specific criticisms, I'm happy to answer those questions. But as I've seen over time, governing New Jersey is enough of a challenge for me at the moment in domestic issues, and I'll stick to that.
So let's go back to party politics for a minute. In 2001, President Bush nominated you to be the U.S. Attorney in Jersey. As of late, public opinion of President Bush continues to rise. What place does President Bush and his ideals have in the Republican Party moving forward, in your view?
He's our last successful politician. Let's start with that, since you said politics. You know, every Republican took for granted George W. Bush while he was there. Guy won 2 national elections. How easy has that looked the last 8 years? He was, first, an outstanding political candidate. And I think he was grossly underappreciated by his own party and by the country as a politician. This was a guy who did things like No Child Left Behind with Ted Kennedy. You can agree or disagree with the policy, but you don't see any of that stuff happening now, do you? So he understood the politics of relationships and understood how to bring people together and spent time on it, both in Texas and as president. I would also say to you that the president, no one ever had to wonder about where the president stood on issues, whether they were domestic or foreign. George Bush had points of view that he expressed rather plainly. And I think there's a time when the country now looks at that and says, hey, that's interesting. So I think that the rising poll numbers you see are the product of 2 things. One, that characteristic of his. And secondly, just the passage of time. You know, when you spend 8 years in any job, people get tired of you, right? I mean, they just get tired of looking at you.
It's my 7th year.
Yeah, I know it's your 7th year at Motorola Solutions. Just a little friendly advice, that's all I'm saying.
7th as CEO.
Yeah.
A little bit longer.
I understand. We don't need to get into specifics now. We can talk later. So I think some of it is when there's some distance that's drawn. That helps. Last thing is, I believe that this former president has been an exemplary former president. He has helped in times when help was needed in crises around the world, whether it was a tsunami, whether it was Hurricane Katrina, or others. When the president called upon him, he was there to help. Secondly, he does not publicly criticize his successor.
Right.
He is not starving for the spotlight. He's not somebody who's waving, oh, remember me? He is acting as a dignified statesman and former president. And I think the more he does that, the more people reevaluate their opinion of him and say, you know, this really is a good, decent, honorable human being who sacrificed 8 years of his life to serve in the toughest job in the world. And so I think those 3 things contribute to his rising standing with the public. And I think ultimately people will look back on the Bush presidency, which I believe was one of the most challenging times that America has ever faced, starting with September 11th, 2001.
Yeah.
And we'll look back on it and say, we had a strong and resolute leader who we didn't always agree with, but who was strong and resolute and not afraid to act. And I think that's a pretty good resume to have.
So let's stick to, let's go to New York City and your make of the election by Bill de Blasio. Do you think there'll be a progressive movement represented by Bill de Blasio, Elizabeth Warren, others, that will have a similar impact on the Democratic Party in this year's elections as the Tea Party did for the Republican Party in 2010? Any parallels?
No, I don't think so. Listen, you said Bill de Blasio and Elizabeth Warren, right? New York City and Massachusetts. You know, I don't think they're affecting the rest of the country all that much. Remember something, New York City has had a 20-year renaissance from liberal democratic policies that was based absolutely exclusively on what I talked about before, about the candidate mattering. Rudy Giuliani and Michael Bloomberg. Now, you can't find probably 2 stronger personalities in American politics. They are very strong, very outspoken, very direct about who they are and what they believe. And I think, when I remember, because I lived there then, right across the river, When Rudy Giuliani was elected, I mean, that New York City was in a state of abject crisis, where they felt like they needed somebody strong to take over the reins and move them in the right direction. And for 20 years, they had that type of leadership. New York City has now gone back to its traditional roots, which is as a home of liberal democratic politics. And Bill de Blasio represents that. I know Mayor de Blasio. I think he's a very nice guy. I think he's an extraordinarily effective politician. And it'll be very interesting from my vantage point to both work with him and to watch how he governs. Campaigning and governing are two very different things. And so I'll be interested to watch how he does it. And as for Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts, I mean, that's, it's like electing, Cory Booker or Bob Menendez in New Jersey. I mean, it's just going to happen. Scott Brown was the anomaly. Elizabeth Warren is in the sweet spot. John Kerry, Ted Kennedy, Ed Markey. It's the same.
Yep.
It's the same thing.
De Blasio has talked about, Governor, the kind of the tale of two cities. He's highlighted income inequality. What's your view of the income inequality gap and the way we rectify it?
I don't think the government rectifies it. I can guarantee you that. Income. And I don't think the American people want income equality. What they want is income opportunity. See, if I go to somebody right now and I say to them, I can guarantee you X dollars a year for the rest of your life, there may be some in America who would accept that. But I think most people in America would go, how do I get a little more than that? That's the spirit of this country. How do I get a little more? I think that the problem we have is an opportunity gap, not an income equality gap. And I think that one of the big discussions and conversations over the course of the next 2 years in national politics is going to be, do you want mediocrity or do you want greatness? You want income equality? That's mediocrity. Everybody can have an equal mediocre salary. That's what we can afford. Or do you want the opportunity for greatness? And greatness is going to be based upon your intellect, your hard work, your creativity. And government can play a role in helping to create that opportunity, but not in being the perpetual referee of what sounds like a fight between my 13-year-old son and my 10-year-old daughter. You did this for him, that's not fair. Well, that's not fair, I want this to be fair. I grew up in an America that said life isn't fair, but opportunity is. And so I believe that this debate is a debate that is, at the moment, being articulated in a way that is going to drive America towards mediocrity, not towards greatness. And I think the debate that needs to be had between the two parties has to be, do we want equality of income or greatness of opportunity? And I believe that the spirit of America is a spirit that's going to say, well, I understand there will be some unfairness in the greatness of opportunity. And by the way, if the government decides on income equality, there'll be unfairness there too. You can be guaranteed. But the opportunity for greatness excites the American people much more.
And isn't the opportunity gap that you described, isn't one of the keys to that education?
Well, sure. Of course, it's probably the defining part of that, especially for those who are trying to make their way up the ladder.
Right.
And that's why the statistics that we have on education in this country should be frightening everybody. You cannot be the #1 power in the world with the 24th rated students in math in the world. You can't be the #1 power in the world with the 14th best readers. You can't. It's gonna catch up to us eventually. Everybody in this room, I suspect, is the product of a system that produced much better. But here's the bad news, everybody, we're gonna die. And who's coming after us? And if it's the 14th and 24th rated people, how are they going to keep us #1? They're not. And that's why the education issue is one that we better get a handle on and start worrying about the success of children more than we care about the comfort of adults. If we do that, then we're gonna have a better country.
Governor, to follow up, couldn't agree with you more on the education piece and the criticality of it. I also believe immigration is key as well. So we had comprehensive immigration reform passed by the Senate, 6832, X months ago. The House Republicans have said, no, we're going to take a more measured approach, step-by-step individual pieces of legislation. X weeks ago, Speaker Boehner led the Republican caucus and said, we're coming out with immigration principles. And now, as of late, literally in the last 5 or 10 days, there seems to be some retrenching or uncertainty about what to do from a Republican perspective around immigration. I personally think it's one of the most important challenges we have. What's your view on how we move the ball forward?
Well, I mean, first is that it has been a missed opportunity for a long time. I mean, let's start off with the fact that the president came in saying it was one of his most important priorities in 2009 and controlled both houses of Congress and did nothing. That's a missed opportunity. Republicans may not have liked what he did with those majorities, like they don't like what he did in some other areas, but he did nothing. And that sent a signal that it was not a priority issue to him. Presidents work on two separate things, those things that are thrust upon them and those things that they thrust upon others. With immigration, neither thing happened. And as a governor, I can tell you, it is enormously frustrating that we now have to undergo a patchwork solution to this, state by state. In my state, for instance, I signed in December a DREAM Act in New Jersey that allows for in-state tuition for undocumented students who have spent at least 3 years in school in New Jersey before college. People say to me, why did you decide to do that? I invest, as a state, nearly $18,000 per pupil per year in every public school student in New Jersey, regardless of their documented status. Our law requires us to educate those children from K to 12, and we pay $18,000 a year. It just made no sense to me any longer that I'm investing all that money in them, and then when I want to take them to the next level, to make them more productive, more trained workers for my state, that I say, yeah, but you're gonna have to pay more for college. Out of no fault of their own, and decisions that were made by others. Now, I shouldn't have to make that decision in New Jersey. There shouldn't be a different standard in New Jersey for that than there is in Illinois, than there is in California, than there is in Texas, than there is in Minnesota. There should be a national policy on how we protect our borders, how we orderly permit folks to enter this country, the orderly process for legalization of those folks. All of those things should be a national policy. The failure by the president and the Congress to do anything on this is now forcing governors, Republicans and Democrats, to make these judgments and make it a patchwork solution in what's supposed to be a United States of America.
Right.
And the failure of the national government to confront this, I think predominantly for political reasons, is a failure by both parties. And they're now forcing governors to make these decisions on a piecemeal basis. It's not the right way to do immigration policy, and we shouldn't be doing it that way.
So let's talk presidential politics from a Republican perspective, and advice of how a Republican can achieve constructive bipartisanship legislation in the context of a vocal and influential Tea Party constituency.
Well, listen, I think there's so much talk about the Tea Party in a way that has been not at all productive. I mean, listen, every political party has elements within it that present challenges. I believe that the Tea Party in the main represents some of the best of Republican principles. Lower taxes, smaller government, restrained government, that puts a premium on individual freedom and liberty as being the great drivers of American success. Now, you will always have some folks who will take a political movement and use it for their own purposes in a way that makes that political movement look less effective, less logical. And that happens on both sides, by the way. You know, you have the MoveOn.org folks too, who I'm sure a lot of Democrats would like to have move on, you know, themselves. So you have this element in both parties. I think that what the Republican Party needs to focus on is what I said to the RNC last August when they asked me to come and speak. Like, we gotta be about winning again. Like, I thought political parties were formed in order to win elections, not to be debating societies, not to be academic institutions to, you know, debate the great esoteric issues of the day just for the sake of debating those issues, to see who wins the debate. Political parties are there to win elections, because when you win, you get to govern. When you get to govern, you get to make change. And that's what we should be focused on as the Republican Party. It is time to win again. 8 years, listen, when you lose the first time, it's a fluke. McCain wasn't a good candidate. Obama was a phenomenon. The economy went in the tank. People hated Iraq and Afghanistan. They didn't like George W. Bush anymore. He was a cowboy caricature of himself. You know, every different excuse in the book. We didn't campaign the right way. But we wait. 4 years from now, this guy was a fluke and he's going to be out. That's what Republicans felt for 4 years. When you lose the second time, those things start to sound fairly hollow. And it's time to start looking within, saying, how can we be better? How can we more effectively articulate our principles and our vision? How can we nominate a candidate who can be an authentic, believable spokesman for a new era in America? And that's not in a vacuum. That person has to be able to do it against somebody else who's trying to do the exact same thing.
Right.
So I think as you look forward to 2016, our party's priority should be on winning. Not winning the argument, winning the election. And I tend to think that most parties who are out of power for 8 years, they get focused on that pretty quick. I remember 2000. And George W. Bush was far from the perfect candidate for some elements of our party, but they kept looking at him going, damn, man, we think he can win. So, all right, you know, we'll suck it up and get behind him, and he won. I remember 1992, when the Democrats had been in the wilderness for 12 years. I have great respect for President Clinton, but he was far from the perfect candidate, all right? There were lots of moments when the Democratic Party could have said, thanks for playing, we'll see you later. Not only because of some of the issues that were raised in the campaign regarding his own history, but also because of the philosophy he was espousing then, which was not traditional Democratic dogma in the tradition of Mike Dukakis, you know, or Walter Mondale, right? But Democrats are going, damn, man, we've had 8 years of Reagan and 4 years of Bush, and okay, you're it, baby, let's go, you know? We're gonna just suck it up and get behind you, because you're the guy. We think you got something there that can win. Parties tend to become pragmatic when they're powerless. It's time for us to get pragmatic.
So you made a comment about looking from within. I've known you almost 4 years, and I'd like you to talk about your family and the closeness. I have a chance to know a little bit of your family, and I thought you'd have the opportunity to talk about your kids and Mary Pat.
Damn, man.
And how it keeps
50
you grounded.
minutes, I finally get a softball, thanks. I thought we were supposed to do that early, you know?
I thought I'd leave it hanging later.
Thank you. I'm exhausted. No, listen, I mean, I think that people in the country now are often so cynical about politicians. And, you know, people give them reason at times for that to happen. And when a politician, you know, talks about their family, or I need to consult with my family before I make this decision, or I'm not doing this because it's not good for my family, or I am doing this because it's good for my family, like everybody just goes, yeah, right, sure. I can tell you that if you have a good family, that is absolutely true. Because this stuff in this life affects them every day. So Mary Pat's here and traveled with me today, and she's got a career of her own that is an outstanding one in the finance business and has been for years and years and years. And then all of a sudden she gets thrust into this non-paying job of First Lady of New Jersey, where people have all kinds of expectations of her. And she's hit every mark, despite the fact that this wasn't her dream, it was mine. That's a really good spouse. And we have 4 really great children. I have, Andrew is 20, and he's a sophomore at Princeton. It's great to have the college life, right? We landed here in Chicago at about 9 o'clock Chicago time this morning, and my cell phone went back on, and I got a text from Andrew, and it was 10:15 when I got this text, East Coast time, and he says, "Hey, sitting here eating breakfast, watching you on CNN." And really cool. And I'm like, he's eating breakfast at 10:15. They're obviously killing him at Princeton. It's amazing. Great. What I've found about college, by the way, is the more you pay, the less they go. It's like a complete inverse relationship. The more expensive the school, the less they go to class, and it's great. But he's a really good kid, plays, despite eating breakfast at 10:15 this morning somewhere. He's a baseball player at Princeton and plays Division I sports, and we're incredibly proud of him. Our daughter, Sarah, is 17, a senior in high school, and she is about to become a daughter of the Midwest. She'll be going to the University of Notre Dame in September. So like it or not, you're going to see a lot more of me out here, walking through Midway and O'Hare on my way to the drive to South Bend. We have a 13-year-old son, Patrick, who's in the 7th grade and is a hockey player, and a 10-year-old daughter, Bridget, who is a vicious 5th grade girls basketball player. Watched her last night playing defense and almost like a little bit like ashamed, right? There was this one girl she was guarding who was not very good. And in 5th grade girls basketball, you can't press. So you have to wait till they get over the mid-court line to play defense. And 3 times in a row, this poor girl came over the mid-court line and picked up her dribble and didn't know what to do with it. And Bridget just went and grabbed the ball out of her hand, drove down the court, and scored a layup 3 times in a row. And I turned to Mary Pat, we were both at the game, and I'm like, it's almost embarrassing now. She's got to stop. Like, chill out a little bit, This poor girl's gonna go home crying, So I have a really intense, involved family. Mary Pat and I spend most weekends going between hockey games and basketball games, and then when the spring comes, Andrew's baseball games down at Princeton. And they're all in this together with me. And it's I'm incredibly fortunate to have that. And I think we should all look at people in public life when they talk about their families a little less cynically. Because when challenges come, and I've certainly been going through one in the last 5 or 6 weeks, don't think it just affects the office holder. It affects their wife, it affects their children. No one's asking for sympathy cards to be sent. But when we say that certain decisions we need to make, we have to think about how it'll affect our family. It does. And there is a legitimacy to that. So I'm fortunate to have a family that's totally behind me and really supportive of me and who brings my wife and my children great joy to my life outside of what I do professionally and enhances me for what I do professionally.
3 last questions.
All right.
Lightning round.
Yes.
Okay. Looking at contemporary public figures, who do you admire most?
Contemporary public figures.
That's right. Oh, I got you a little.
Great admiration for Rob Portman. Gotten to know Rob over time, and I think he is a bright, able, principled public servant who gets it.
Okay. Greatest Republican president of the past century?
Of the past century? Well, if you're going to restrict me to the past century, it'd be Reagan.
You talked about leadership in politics, no walk in the park. You said it's not beanbag.
Correct.
Why do you serve? Why do you do this?
I deluded myself at one point into believing that I could actually make a difference. And then once you get into it and you start to make a difference, it becomes geometric. And you begin to think, well, if I can make a difference on this, how about that? And then how about that? And how about that? It's exciting to be able to have a chance to have effect on the lives of people, you probably will never meet and certainly will never know. And it's the one job in the world, being in public life, and especially as an executive, where you can do that. It is not without challenge. But when I think about that, neither is being near the end of your run at Motorola Solutions, apparently. But given the 8-year thing, I mean, every job where there's great responsibility and great opportunity brings with it enormous challenge and sometimes some pain. But I don't think that any of us who have had this opportunity would substitute it, would give it away. I think there's a time for everybody to be able to do public life. I said to David Hero before, maybe it's time for me to go make some money, that being a unique thing in my life, after spending the last 12 years of my life in public life. But everybody's got to make those judgments.
Sure. I
think in the end, though, Greg, it's if you really believe that you have an opportunity to make a difference in people's lives, and you've been born in the greatest country the world's ever known, that's provided you with such enormous opportunity. My grandmother, my mom's mom, who was a first-generation American, used to say to me all the time, Christopher, you owe part of your life to this country. Figure out how you're going to pay that debt back. And I think lots of Americans feel that way, and we should be talking to our children that way too, because despite all the different problems and difficulties we spoke about today, I'm not looking to change passports. I like living here. This is the greatest country in the world, and we just have to work a little bit harder to make sure it's great for our children and grandchildren, and that's why I'm in this.
Thank you for coming to Chicago.
Happy to
Thanks
be
for
here.
doing this.
Thank you very much.
Governor, thank you.
On behalf of the Economic Club,
Thank you
we
very much.
appreciate your being here.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.